Greetings and God bless you. I want to first of all extend my thanks to Dean Gray and Reverend Thurman and other ministers who've gone before me for the opportunity to speak on the 7 deadly sins. And today we're going to talk about the sin of pride. And I have a text in mind, Proverbs 6:16, which reads, "There are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him." And in this 6th proverb, you see an association between 2 words that are very rare and rarely found together, and that is God and hate. And for God to hate something, there must be a very strong reasoning behind that, because all of our lives we've been taught what John wrote in his epistle, which is that God is love. And yes, he is love, but God is also a God of wrath. And both of these attributes coexist in his eternal nature. And so I asked myself, what specifically about pride? What is it about pride that God detests? And in the ensuing verses in 17 through 19, I'm going to read it quickly. It says, these are the 7 things which are an abomination to God: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, a hand that sheds innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run to evil rapidly, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers. And in these 3 verses, we see that although the verses begin with verse 17 talking about haughty eyes or arrogance, all of the sins that follow that can be directly related back to pride or arrogance or haughtiness. And what exactly does that mean? This is God's way of expressing his disgust with arrogance. It was pride and arrogance that ultimately led the serpent to try to be God, to twist the words of God, to lust after the power of God. The prophet Ezekiel writes in the 28th chapter of his book, in the 13th verse, and I'm paraphrasing this, Ezekiel writes, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. On the day that you were created, they were prepared." And then in verse 14a, it says, "You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there." But then in verse 17, you read this in Ezekiel 28, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor." Isaiah records these words about the serpent: "I will ascend above the heavens, above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High." And God's response to that was this: "Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, into the recesses of the pit." Pride is quite literally a desire to usurp the power of God and take matters into our own hands. This is why the writer of Proverbs tells us plainly that pride goes before destruction and haughtiness goes before a great fall. So while pride may seem like something small to us, it is a big thing to God, because it is what ultimately led to the downfall of man, and it means that our hearts have been exalted and lifted up against him. It is this pride and arrogance that was passed down to humanity in the first human sin. The first sin that man ever committed was committed out of pride. It was a selfish desire that placed the wants of man over the obedience to God. It was man putting ourselves ahead of God, although God in his omniscience had already warned Adam that death would be the consequence of his disobedience if he took from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we've been dealing with this ever since. On a human level, pride is the inability to check our ego. It is a refusal to have the mind of Christ. It is the selfish desire to have things our way rather than to have them God's way. And Scripture tells us that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And I don't know about you, but I can't overcome God's opposition. None of us are able to overcome the opposition of God. Our arms are too short to box with him, which is why Jesus came to teach us about humility. Humility is the antithesis and the antidote for a prideful heart. It is a fruit of the Spirit, and it is given to counter our innate pridefulness. Pride is our desire to sit at the head of the table, but humility saves our embarrassment of being told to move down to a lower seat. It is in our humility that we learn to wash the feet of others rather than looking to be served. It is in our humility that we learn to have the mind of Christ, which means putting others before ourselves. It is in our humility that we learn that our egos are an existential threat to our walk with God, and that we must often check ourselves before we wreck ourselves. It is in our humility that we learn to obey God rather than, as Adam and Eve did, looking for loopholes in what God has already spoken. Peter instructs the young men who were addressed in his epistle to humble themselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. And I know we live in an era of unedited, conscious self-expression. I know that we live in a time where we're unabashedly us. I know we live in a time of social media facilitated self-exaltation and self-imposed greatness, but there's still a place for humility. Humility is not the attenuation of our greatness. It is recognizing that God is the source of our greatness. It is, as the psalmist says, it is He who's made us and not we ourselves. And don't get this twisted. Humility is not walking around mealy-mouthed, shuffling around, looking at the ground. No, it's looking up to God and realizing that He is the supplier of all things good and perfect. God's exaltation only comes to one with a humble heart. A heart that realizes that we don't control anything, but God controls everything. A humbled heart realizes that God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. And so today, brothers and sisters, let us focus on having the mind of Christ. Let us focus on living lives of humility. Let us focus on living lives of obedience unto God. And always remember, pride goes before destruction, and haughtiness goes before a great fall. But the Lord gives grace to the humble. Godspeed, brothers and sisters, and may the Lord bless you and keep you.